And good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Free Thought Forum. I'm your host, presented by the Pennsylvania Nonbelievers. I'm your host for the night, Jacob, and once again, I'm joined by Doug.
Hi, everyone.
And we got a lot to talk about tonight. As a reminder, I'll be talking a little bit about the history and some of the historical claims about Jesus. But first of all, we got quite a few upcoming events as well as a few developing. So I'm going to hand it over to Doug for that.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, these are the Free Thought Forum announcements for 14th April show. April the 15th, tomorrow, a member from a Dillsburg Free Thinkers group is scheduled to give the opening invocation for the PA State Senate. This is the first non-theist invocation in their history. And members from several local groups will be on hand to witness this first for Pennsylvania. I know that PAN itself has been working to make this happen for at least the last 10 years. And finally it's happened. So also tomorrow...
I should know that's going to be at 11 a.m. 11 a.m.
Correct.
Oh, sorry, yeah, I didn't have that down here. Also tomorrow, April 15th, will be the monthly meeting of ASK, a newly formed humanist group in Lancaster. They are meeting at 6:30 p.m. at the Isaacs on Mannheim Pike. Now, continuing now with other PAN events, April 21st is the Chambersburg meeting from 7 to 9 at the Supreme Buffet Hibachi Grill. April 22nd is the Lancaster meeting starting at 6:30 p.m. also at the Isaacs the Mannheim Pike in Lancaster. April 24th is the opening game for the Yorks baseball team in the REVS
Revs.
You can tell me that I'm not a baseball fan, can't you?
Short for revolution.
Okay. No offense to the real and true fans of the group, okay? PAN will have members helping out at one of the concession stands to help support the Margaret Moore home. Come to the game, enjoy the start of the season. If you want to help at the concession stands, contact PAN Facebook website. Okay, April 28th is the next broadcast of this Free Thought Forum, and I and Jacob will be presenting the history of blasphemy, and we'll define what it is. May the 2nd is the next York PAN meeting from 12 noon in the UUCY Carriage House behind the main building on South George Street. May 13th is the next Lebanon meeting. May 14th is the next Harrisburg meeting. Also, on Mother's Day, May the 10th, PAN will once again have a booth on the southwest corner of Market and Beaver Streets. Always lively talk and a great time. This event marks the start of our booth season. Really should drop by, ask questions, pick up some of our free pamphlets and everything, and you'll find out a little more about atheists. And during one of our May broadcasts, we will be hosting a discussion on free will. Like, does free will exist? Does it even matter? Like that. While we are talking about calendar events, don't forget that every Friday there are secular AA meetings we call agnostics at the Lancaster General Hospital. you'll find a like an easel with the event on it and directing you to the place down in the lobby. And finally, the Free Thought Forum is helping to publicize the Hotline Project, a number to call to help those struggling between faith and atheism, and the number is 184 I doubt it, and that's 1844 368 2848. I hope I spoke slowly enough for you to write it down. And now, back to our host for the night, Jacob.
All right, thanks, Doug. I actually have one other upcoming event that this is kind of on short notice, but we're working actually on getting David Smalley in Pennsylvania on May the 3rd at Lebanon College. I don't have quite all the details yet, but we just got approval for it. He will be, again, on Sunday, May 3rd. David Smalley is the host of Dogma Debate, which is one of the more popular podcasts in the atheist movement. And he also does a lot of work with publishing audio books. And he's actually recorded a couple. And he's also has his own book called Baptized Atheist. I don't have. We'll have more information on that for next show, including a little bit more on time and location. But we're still a lot of working on the details. I only just got word that we are going to go ahead with this morning. But just make sure that you're aware of that. But to get into the topic tonight, we have what we're going to be doing is talking a little bit about the historical claims about Jesus. You know, we just went through Easter, and of course, there's all sorts of television specials all over the place about Jesus and his life. And
programs on TV, like AD, the Bible Continues, and the Dove Keepers.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you look at a lot of apologists, they tend to focus on the life of Jesus. It's you rarely see somebody defending anything in the Old Testament. If you look, one of the most popular works of apologetics ever was The Case for Christ. By Lee Strobel, and that's entirely what it was about. And if you look at say William Lane Craig, his standard act is he only defends God in the very abstract sense, except for the little bit where he talks about Jesus. So I mean, this is really the cornerstone of apologetics. Now, of course, we as atheists, we don't really believe that, a lot of what they say about Jesus, the divine man God, so to speak.
Especially the divine
right.
Part. He was not a deity.
But it's still sort of interesting to get into, well, what was the real Jesus like? What can we actually know about him?
Other than what is written in the Gospels.
Right. Is basically, that's what I mean. Is what can we know about him? We know there were a lot of messianic figures roaming around first century Judea. So it's kind of interesting, well, was he just one more of those guys, or what can we know about him? And apologists tend to just say, well, we have all, they'll try to claim that Jesus is the best attested person in history. So much. We have all this great evidence for him, and they'll produce this long list of witnesses who supposedly attest to the life of Jesus. So let's take a look at those. Well, let's take a look at what they're saying.
Why
not? Now, when I first came out as an atheist to my parents, the first thing they did was hand me the book "Evidence That Demands a Verdict" by Josh McDowell. And Josh McDowell is a Campus Crusade for Christ minister. And I was interested to read the chapter on Jesus outside the Bible. Because I figured, if you're going to make an evidentiary case, that's where you have to make it. And one thing I couldn't help but notice was that kind of jumped right out at me on his list is a lot of them were coming centuries later, and when he quoted them, they were pretty obviously Christian preachers. For example, he cited Eusebius, who was a 4th century Christian monk.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, not particularly good evidence.
Well, Flavius Josephus.
Well, I'll get into that later.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, but yeah, but you know, a lot of them are just later Christian preachers, and really, the Christian sources after the Gospels have gone into circulation are really no good. You know, they're pretty much all just reaffirming what the Gospels are saying. So they really don't tell us anything. So we can really just kind of disregard all of those. Even some of the ones, you know, outside the Bible before the Gospels went into circulation. For example, a letter from Clement of Rome didn't really talk about Jesus at all. Or the letters of Ignatius are pretty much considered to be just forgeries anyway. So really we're just going to disregard all of that. So first I want to look at the pagan sources. You know, from, you know, what do the hostile people say to that? And when you look at the pagan sources, I like what Bart Ehrman said about them, who was a biblical scholar. He said the amount of sources for Jesus in the 1st century from pagan sources is truly breathtaking. There are none.
Yeah.
Nothing.
You had me going there for a second. I was like,
Yeah.
what are you reading?
Yeah. He says. That's what he actually says in his book, Jesus Interrupted. Is, you know, it's really breathtaking. They don't have a thing to say about him in the 1st century. Sometimes you'll hear Thales mentioned, who was supposed to attest to the supernatural darkness that covered the sky during the death of Jesus. That's mentioned in a couple of the Gospels. The problem, although that's a pretty dubious citation, apologists claim that he was writing in 52 AD and trying to say, well, it was actually just a natural eclipse, or trying to find a natural explanation for it. The problem is we don't actually have that writing to know what he was talking about, or any of the context of what he was saying. In fact, we don't have anything until a 3rd century Christian monk talks about it. And we don't even have that writing either. We have that writing being talked about from a 9th century Byzantine monk. So it's like we've got, you know, double hearsay here. And neither of them, and we don't have any direct quotations of the source. And even the 52 AD that's been asserted for the writing of that comes from some speculation by a single scholar over 200 years ago. So, I mean, this is, you know, this doesn't have a leg to stand on. And if the supernatural darkness had actually happened, we'd have a few more sources than just this one really questionable one. You know, no one would even bother with Thales if this actually happened.
Well, I mean, supposedly a whole lot of other events occurred during this
Right.
time. You know, that saints arose from their grave
Right.
during that time. But, you know, if you were a saint and you rose out of the grave, supposedly you're not going to look like a zombie or the Walking Dead. What are you going to do? Are you going to go into Jerusalem and, you know, go?
Well, it actually said in the Gospels, it actually says they appeared to many.
Yeah.
So it's like, you would think if that actually happened, somebody other than just the Gospel of Matthew would say something about it.
Yeah. Also, what happened to them, you know, afterwards? Did they just climb back in the grave? Or, you know?
Right. So, that's kind of how bad the sources are. And actually, the total silence of early history towards it pretty much rules out the divine Jesus altogether right then and there. But let's go in a little bit more into some of the other pagan sources. a lot of times you'll hear the first pagan source you come to is Pliny the Younger, who was a governor of a province in northwest Asia Minor, which is modern-day Turkey. And he's the first time we hear about Christians from a pagan author. And the funny thing is that's all he talks about is Christians. He never actually talks about Jesus at all, which is sort of weird why they're even citing him. What it is he was governor of a province there, and some Christians were meeting illegally, and he arrests some. I think he actually even executed a couple, and then he writes back to the emperor explaining the situation, and pretty much asking, "Well, what should I do about this?" Mm-hmm. And I heard someone respond to this saying, "You know what? I'm happy to concede that there were Christians in the 2nd century." Because that's all it says, and actually, quite a few of the sources are just that. I was reading some of the quotations, even by Josh McDowell as he was quoting them, where all they were doing was talking about Christians, and they're like, "Hey, there's this cult, and this is what they believe," and that I'm like, I don't doubt that. I don't doubt that they believe that. But they're not making any pronouncement as to whether what they believe is true. Mm-hmm. Now, the next thing you hear is maybe Tacitus. And this is a widely treasured source because Tacitus was a Roman historian, and actually a very good one at that. And he makes really what can be considered the first reference to Jesus ever. And what it was is he was talking about Christians he was talking about Emperor Nero blaming the Christians for the fire in Rome. And he makes a short digression on who Christians are. And there's a section where he actually says Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. Mm-hmm. But that's the most he actually attests to. That's the most specific he gets. But if you think about it, even that isn't very impressive, because this is after the Gospels have gone into circulation. So this might be just what he was told by Christians, and actually even by his friend Pliny the Younger. He was actually pretty good friends with Pliny the Younger, and he might have just heard it from Pliny the Younger. And to him, probably the idea that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate wasn't worth investigating, because that wasn't even what he was talking about. He was talking about, Nero blaming the fire during in Rome during Nero. And I say that's at best what it gets you. At worst, the whole passage is a forgery.
Yeah.
Mainly because in some of the early manuscripts to it, it doesn't say Christians, but Christians, which was an entirely different cult. And in fact, other Roman writers talk about that cult in other places. And it's interesting that no other early Christian writing mentions the persecution under Nero. Mm-hmm. Like none of the books of Acts, none of the various books of Acts, or any of the 2nd century writings say anything about it.
Well, it doesn't follow really the story they wanted of Jesus that they wanted to create. They wanted to create a religion of Christianity. Right.
So it just, and in fact, nobody actually talks about that persecution until a series of forgeries in the 4th century. So it just, it's probably, this, one of the most treasured sources says nothing interesting at most and is a forgery at worst. Mm-hmm. And that's really how we look at most of these sources. And what's really strange is some people will even cite Lucian, who was a 2nd century a pagan writer, who actually wrote satirical critiques of Christianity.
Yeah.
And it's that would be like Mormons citing an article from The Onion about the angel Moroni. It's just, it's like nothing. So really, there are no pagan sources. When you start to scrutinize the pagan sources, they just fall apart. So, but if Jesus was just, some illiterate nobody, it's reasonable to think that the pagans missed all of us.
Yeah.
It's okay, maybe they missed it. But maybe the Jews can tell us something. First, we'll look at the Talmud. And
Good place to start.
yes, it's one of the central writings of Judaism. And Christian apologists will tell you that they talk about Jesus being the illegitimate child of a Roman centurion and was stoned for practicing magic and leading Israel astray.
Yeah.
And he had several disciples who were, some of their names were actually fairly similar to what we see in the Gospels. So this actually sounds like some pretty decent evidence. Mm-hmm. Until you realize they're talking about two different people named Jesus. Mm-hmm. The first was Jesus Pandiro, who lived in the 1st century BC. And then there was Jesus Ben Stada, who lived in the 2nd century AD. So neither of them lived in the correct century to be the Jesus.
Yeah.
And the circumstances of their death was pretty different too. Like I just said, the one was actually stoned, not crucified, and it was by Jews, not Romans. And he was held in captivity for 40 days, not just overnight.
Yeah. Well, Romans didn't stone anyone.
Right. But my point was he was executed by the Jews, not executed by the Romans.
Yeah.
So it was. So sometimes apologists will try to pull this dishonest sleight of hand, because on the surface it sounds promising.
Yeah.
But when you start, and it's worth noting that Jesus was actually a very popular name back then.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, most people.
Yeah. The next. What's that? No, sorry. I was just going to say the next. I think we were just coming to that. When we get to the next source I was coming to is the most popular source among all Christian apologists, and I think you know which one it is.
Could it be Josephus?
Oh yeah, Josephus.
Yeah. Flavius Josephus, born in 37 A.D., about 4 years after Christ was crucified, and he died in about 100 A.D. He was a very well-educated son of a nobleman named Matthias, and also a mother of royal blood. His parents were basically aristocrats, but he was a Jew.
Yeah, and he wrote a lot of his histories on various aspects of Judaism, and like the Jewish War, and and his popular work, Antiquities of the Jews, which has, in one of the chapters, has a paragraph dedicated to Jesus.
May I just read that?
Sure, go ahead and read it.
Okay. As you can notice, I got a big book here just on Josephus. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And
we can read the rest of it.
Okay. Sorry, he was the Christ. I lost my... he was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared unto them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold, and the 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The whole passage is so blatantly fraudulent that
Yeah.
nobody thinks it's authentic.
Yeah,
It's-
I mean, there is two trains of thought here.
Yeah.
One that is definitely a forgery because the syntax
Right.
and the grammar that is used do depart from
Right.
what he has in other works. He wrote it in Greek. So everything that we now know about the thing is actually been translated in somewhere in the 1700s by a guy named William Whiston. Okay, and later were translated into other language. This William Whiston was also a Christian. He seemed to be very fair, though, but
Yeah.
who knows what he really wrote in Greek?
Well, I mean, it does say that in Greek as well. But the thing is, there's a couple trains. I thought you were going to say a couple trains of thoughts is. Some people try to argue that this is only a partial forgery, and that's what apologists typically try to do. Is say, oh, he said something here, but a later monk, just like a later copyist, just spruced it up a bit.
Yeah.
But there's several reasons to think that's not the case. For one, none of the early Christian Christian apologists, such as Origen, cite this source. In fact, nobody does for the first couple centuries of its existence, which it's not because nobody happened to read it. I mean, they were citing Josephus left and right for other things. Like, Josephus even mentions John the Baptist, which they actually used to prove parts of the gospel. It was its account of was Josephus' accounts of John the Baptist. But then they turn around and grumble that he had nothing to say about Jesus.
Yeah.
And in fact, the first person who citing it is Eusebius in the 4th century. Our good old buddy Eusebius.
Mm-hmm.
I should say our big fat liar Eusebius. He was probably the one who forged it. It's not we're just speculating it's a forgery. I mean, it's like we're even pretty sure we know who did it.
Yeah.
Actually, and Eusebius is responsible for a lot of forgeries as well. And he even has a chapter in one of his books titled, "Sometimes it be necessary to use falsehood as a remedy for those who require such things." Mm-hmm. I'm not even kidding. That's exactly what he said.
Now, we're talking about Josephus?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just saying that's why they think that the whole thing is just a forgery.
Well, they also believe, or many believe, that Josephus was never at Masada like he claimed to be in order to give the account. They said his accounts were inaccurate, especially of where Caiaphas' his temple home was. It was on the wrong side of Masada, and also he described the columns of Caiaphas's. They were Drummond and not monolithic, as described in there. And back then, they made a big thing of the design and of the columns that was used to support many houses. So someone like him would not have known. He wouldn't have written the wrong thing down. I don't think he would be that confused.
Yeah, but there's one other. There's one other point where he mentions Jesus, and that's when he's referring to the death of James, who is supposed to be the brother of Jesus.
Yep.
But the strange thing is the story really makes no sense, because what happens in the passage is a high priest Anana, well, not Anana, I'm sorry, I can't remember what the name of the high priest was, but he gets the brother of James killed, which upsets the Jews. It gets James, the brother of Jesus, killed, which upsets the Jewish establishment, so they run after the Roman governor to demand they unseat the high priest, and they install in this place another person named Jesus in his place. And the most likely explanation is it's actually that Jesus who was the brother of the James who got killed. Well, it's like the brother of the man who was unjustly murdered, who got installed in the place of the high priest who killed him. Mm-hmm. So that's, although most apologists will kind of gloss right over that.
Are you going to get into Barabbas?
That's coming later, a lot later. Right now, I'm just addressing Jesus outside the Bible.
Yeah.
And whenever you start breaking down the sources outside the Bible, you start to find out that there are no sources outside the Bible. Mm-hmm. All of them are just coming later, or not saying anything particularly relevant, or forgeries. And which is really strange, because even if the non-miraculous things in the life of Jesus had happened, you'd think somebody would have made note of it. Mm-hmm. And the early Christians would have preserved that account. They would have loved it, since considering how much they preserved the barest mention of Jesus in other writings, it seems absolutely impossible that they would have failed to preserve everything. Mm-hmm. And what's really strange is we also have sections where they appear to be, some books, some history books, just go mysteriously missing. Like one particular spot that could have told us something about Christianity, it's just like that one book out of many is gone, as if it's trying to cover up the silence of history.
And also, there's really no history of Jesus as a child other than his birth.
Yeah.
But it doesn't talk about his teens or his 20s.
Right. But yeah, so really, when you get down to it, that's why, sometimes when you read apologetics, they'll try to present a semi-serious case, and then they'll just start going into the Bible, because that's all there really is. Mm-hmm. So let's take a look at the Bible, what it has to say.
Oh, I didn't bring my Bible with me. I'm sorry.
I have it on my Kindle.
Okay.
But the oldest writings in the Bible are obviously the epistles, although a lot of them are later forgeries. But from the authentic ones, they really don't tell us much about Jesus at all. They don't tell us anything about his childhood, his miracles. And in fact, there's one place where Paul almost rules out that Jesus did miracles, where he said the Jews require a sign which would be a stumbling block, which is why would that be? Because the Gospel of John is trying to say that Jesus was doing signs left and right. And there's this also, and then in Galatians, when Paul actually goes to meet with the Jerusalem pillars, which includes Peter, he dismisses Peter as being a nobody with nothing to contribute to him. Which is how could Peter, even if Jesus was, how could Peter have nothing interesting to say to Paul? Mm-hmm. It really makes you, that's really, really strange. And in 1 Peter, which this letter is a bit disputed. They're not quite sure if Peter wrote it or not. 2 Peter is definitely a forgery, but 1 Peter is questionable. But in it, Peter says he was a witness to the suffering of Christ. But the problem is whenever he gives his account of what happened and he starts talking about what happened to Jesus, mm-hmm. all he's really doing is quoting from Isaiah 53. not really saying anything he himself witnessed, just quoting from the Bible, from the Old Testament. And then there's if you take a look at the book of Acts, which is supposed to be early church history, in all of the trial scenes, Jesus is never really mentioned. You know, when the early Christians are on trial for their lives, basically, they're not like, hey, you guys were there. How do you explain all of that? Mm-hmm. All they talk about is visions and, the visions they've had, or different other things.
Yeah, how convenient.
And really, and one thing that's suspect about Acts is it looks like it's completely whitewashing history, church history. Like they try to make Peter and Paul look like they were best buds, who just had a minor disagreement. But if you look at the letters of Paul, they hated each other. I kind of look at it like, you read a history book about our founding fathers, and then you go read what the founding fathers actually wrote, and you'll get a bit of a different story about them.
Yes, I mean, it's one of they didn't kill each other.
Yeah. So, really, the epistles are no good either, which is really, really crazy. So, really, all the evidence comes down to is just the Gospels. And, the canonical Gospels. And they're all actually based on Mark, and we'll come back to Mark in a few minutes. And Matthew was the second gospel written, and it reproduced over 90% of Mark. And actually, as Randall Helms demonstrates in the book Gospel Fictions, Matthew is extensively rewriting portions of the Old Testament to be narratives about Jesus. Like stories about Elijah are now becoming stories about Jesus, or like the scene at the tomb is pretty much a copy of Daniel in the lion's den, like right down to the description of the angel. Like the description of the angel is almost exactly the way it's presented in Daniel. And that's Gospel Fictions by Randall Helms, and I should back up a second. Actually, there's another book you can check out called The Mystery of Acts by Richard Purvo, where he shows how basically Acts is fiction, and how the author of Acts was essentially trying to make Paul look like Jesus. Mm-hmm. Like the stories from the Gospels are being rewritten for Paul.
Now, if any of you people out there want to comment on this, we'll put our number up on the screen and we'll talk to you live over the phone. Questions or comments are welcome.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, that's all right. And a lot of things you'll see within in the Gospel of Matthew is everything Jesus does is supposed to be in fulfillment of the prophecies. Mm-hmm. That's one thing Matthew's really pounding. But it's pretty obvious that he's fabricating those stories just to fit the prophecies.
Yeah.
And actually, there's a point where there's this one story where he's a dead giveaway. That's what he's doing, and that's in the Palm Sunday narrative, because every other gospel, Jesus is just riding in on a donkey. Mm-hmm. But for some reason, Matthew decides to say that Jesus is riding in on two animals, straddling them.
He's a rodeo clown.
Yeah. Now, why is he doing that? Because Matthew has misunderstood Zechariah 9:9, which says, "Behold," and I quote, "Behold, your king is coming to you, humble, and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now, what it is in their writing styles, they would sometimes repeat a line in different wording to bring emphasis to it. Mm-hmm. So that's all that last phrase is just repeating the line, but Matthew is misunderstood and think it's actually talking about two different donkeys here. So yeah, this is the one, if you're going to get a discussion, bring that up, because that's a dead giveaway that he's just making this up to fit the prophecies. And another interesting part is he also says, I'll mention here, he also says Jesus coming out of Nazareth was supposed to be a prophecy. That appears nowhere in the Old Testament.
No, it was not.
So apparently they were using other scriptures as sources that we just don't have.
They predicted in the Old Testament that a king, a warrior king,
Right.
was going to save them and come and save them like that, and there was no way that Jesus was a warrior king.
But we'll get into that a little bit later. But especially when we come back to Mark, because that plays into the Barabbas story, which we'll get to in a moment.
Yeah, we've only got about 20 minutes left.
Yeah, I'll move quickly through these last little bit. But Luke is also copying from Mark, the Gospel of Luke, and he might also be copying from Matthew. That's a little bit in dispute, but actually, but he's also seems to be mining from the works of Josephus, and sometimes he makes mistakes in citing things. So, and that's how we know he's copying from Josephus and not the other way around. He also seems to have copied his passion story from the story of Romulus, because they're like in the story of Romulus, Romulus after he resurrects appears to someone traveling along the road, which is also you see in Luke, and also in both those stories, the person he appears to. In the story of Romulus, it means the person's name means something like proclaimer, and in Luke it means to proclaim. So it's basically, it's a dead giveaway that these are the same story. And there's numerous parallels throughout the story. So because of this, there's really no historical value to Luke either. Now, when we get to John, now people think that John is so different that he couldn't have been copying from anybody else. But actually, it's at least obvious he's copying from Mark because his passion story is the same. But it's also evident he's copying from Luke because of the story of Lazarus. And I'll give you a thumbnail of it. In the Gospel of Luke, in the Gospel of John, Jesus raises Lazarus. But in Luke, Lazarus is in the parable of the rich man, poor man, where like the rich man looks up and is down in hell, looks up into heaven and says, could you resurrect the poor man to go warm my brothers? And the poor man was actually named Lazarus. And God says, no, if they didn't believe Moses and the prophets, they won't believe him, which was actually a running theme throughout the Synoptic Gospels, where they say, Jesus doesn't perform signs to prove himself. But in John, he is performing signs to prove himself. So he does resurrect Lazarus. And it even says that because of that, people started believing Jesus. So, as David Fitzgerald once put it, the discrepancies in the Gospels, people who try to resolve the contradictions in the Gospels are ignoring one thing, and that is these contradictions are on purpose. They're there to serve a very specific purpose. So they're not done in ignorance of each other. But back to Mark, because when you get down to it, now like there's no everybody else is copying off of Mark or somebody else. So the last thing we have left as the only evidence for Jesus is just Mark itself, which is actually quite literally fiction. And Richard Carrier's new book on the historicity of Jesus, he actually dissects the structure of Mark to show that he is writing fiction. He's writing a novel here.
So it might be a good idea for anyone in the audience to actually read that book.
Yeah, it's really long, but it really dissects the Gospel of Mark to show what he's doing. And as some have noted, it's also chock full of symbolism. And the best example of that is the story of Barabbas, where Jesus and Barabbas are in front of Pilate, where the Jews are picking which one they want to let go. But the interesting thing is, there's no actual Roman or Jewish records of this tradition at all happening.
Yeah, they didn't perform the tradition like Pilate would forgive one of the people because it was festival.
Yeah.
The closest that you could get to it was the fact that there were times when the emperor or Pilate would he would forgive someone on his birthday, on Pilate's birthday, and on the emperor's. But to say that he just went and forgive someone is not true. And also, another interesting fact is, people talk about Barabbas and Jesus, and the people choosing Jesus, forget that Barabbas and his first name was also Jesus.
Well, at least in the Syrian manuscripts.
Yeah, it was Jesus Barabbas, and Barabbas actually means son of the Lord, or
Son of the Father.
Son of the Father, yeah.
So here you have two Jesus sons of the Father.
Yeah, so if the story was true about the rabble in the street, the Jewish rabble in the street, saying, give us Barabbas, what were they talking about? Were they talking about Jesus Barabbas, or were they talking about Jesus Christ? Or,
Well, what it was is the whole scenario is supposed to be an allegory for the Jewish Day of Atonement, where you would have the scapegoat. One would be where they would take two goats, and one would be sacrificed to atone for the sins of Israel, and the other would be a scapegoat to take the sins of Israel, and they would run it into the wilderness to carry the sins of Israel away.
Yeah,
and part of the symbolism there is that Barabbas was a murderer and a rebel, which was supposed to be the sins of Israel, because at this point the Romans have already had to put down, I think, 2 different Jewish rebellions. So this was supposed to be like the sins of Israel are rebellion and murder.
Yeah, but Barabbas was supposed to be a real insurrectionist,
right?
More so than.
And part of the symbolism is, you said that the Jews thought it was going to be a conquering Messiah. So what Mark was also doing there was saying the Jews have chosen this rebel over the actual Messiah, because because at the time the Christians held a different interpretation to the Old Testament than what many of the Jews did.
Yeah.
And that was meant to symbolize it. Because one of the things that's important to note is Judaism was pretty splintered back then. In part due to the Roman occupation, but they were never really that unified to begin with. Yeah. Scholars have identified at least 10 different Jewish sects. There may have been as many as 30. All having different interpretations, so this was just one more among many.
Yeah.
And so this is what we mean by symbolism. You could go on for episodes on just how much symbolism was in Mark. But this was probably the best example, because the whole thing echoed the Jewish Day of Atonement. And it also was, a symbol for what, the Jews rejecting the actual Messiah.
It was all allegorical.
Yeah. And there's also, as some people have noted, it's odd that there's a lot of seagoing adventures in landlocked Galilee in the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah.
Which would suggest that is one of the many indications that the works of Homer have inspired Mark. Also, there's the point where, like, the disciples of Jesus don't seem to understand what's going on in Mark, which is actually kind of like the crew of the Odyssey and the workers of Homer being completely clueless. I hear some apologists go, well, it must have been true because, the disciples wouldn't write that about themselves. But the actual explanation is if you see, any story about a hero, they usually put dumb people right next to them to make the hero look that much better.
Yeah.
So
it's like going out to a nightclub, and you always have an ugly friend with you.
Yeah, it's that's the kind of thing. And because of all of that, we really find that Mark is completely fiction. Meaning, when you get down to it, there's absolutely no evidence for Jesus at all. Some people will try to make some indirect evidence, like, the facts and the details in the Gospels would be too embarrassing for anybody to believe. But if you look through pagan literature, several of the dying and rising gods they believed in suffered embarrassing deaths.
Yeah.
It wasn't anything for people to believe. And it might maybe some of the snobbish elite wouldn't like it, but it really makes that God more personable to the masses. As I heard one politician say, every politician wants you to think they were born in a log cabin they built themselves.
Yeah.
And and that's really the way the dying and rising gods worked, is they were trying to make it something that the average folk could cling on to.
Yeah, because they witnessed it themselves, and they wasn't there just storytellers.
And you might also hear things like, well, nobody would believe women being the first witnesses to the tomb. Like, no one would make up a story of that. But the problem is actually Josephus himself sometimes used female sources. Mm-hmm. So obviously it wasn't a problem for them to believe it. Now, women weren't generally allowed to testify in court, but that was more out of tradition rather than like a trust issue.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Josephus, his account of what happened at Masada was from a woman, a Jew that was supposedly there. So that was the dove keepers, which I only watched a little bit of it, like about 10 minutes, and then I go, oh, I don't want to watch this kind of fantasy.
But in the last couple of minutes here, I just want to, obviously there's just too much to go through. Like, we could talk for hours and hours on this, but I just want to give you the primer on it. If you want to check out some of the works, I would. I already mentioned On the Historicity of Jesus by Richard Carrier. Nailed by David Fitzgerald is also a pretty good startup, a pretty good introduction to it. Just all the problems with the historical claims to the point we find there's really no evidence. But
go ahead.
Which is why more and more scholars are starting to suspect that Jesus never even existed at all. And one of the things we find is like a late first century text known as the Ascension of Isaiah, where it's account of the entire death and resurrection of Jesus happening on a spiritual plane. Mm-hmm. And actually there's allusions to it in both the book of Hebrews and throughout the letters of Paul, or at least to a similar belief.
Yeah.
And it's similar to another story called the Descent of Inanna, who, in that story, we actually get traces of it showing up in the Bible, such as in Ezekiel, where where essentially women are doing a certain. I don't have time to go into the details of it, but basically, there's part of the ritual of it is happening in the temple.
Yeah.
And also the idea that they would tell a public story Well, I'll back up a second. The idea that another cult that said their whole death and resurrection of their god happened on the spiritual plane was the Osiris cult. But what they told to the public was that it happened on Earth. And whenever you became initiated into the cult, they would give you the real story.
Yeah.
That that the whole thing happened on the spiritual plane. And that's significant because in the Gospel of Mark, one sec, I need to pull it up here real quick. In Mark 4:12, it has this really bizarre passage where, well, I say Mark 4:11, when he was alone with his disciples, he said unto them, "To you it has been given to know the secret of the kingdom of God, but to those outside, everything comes in parables, in order that they may look and not perceive, that they may indeed listen but not understand, so that they may not turn again and be forgiven."
Yeah.
And that's really bizarre if you think about the typical Christian idea that, hey, everyone's supposed to understand this and be forgiven. But basically he's saying there is, the outsiders are being told one thing, but you've been given the secret, the mystery. And so what really Mark is writing a parable to conceal the secret teachings of a mystery faith.
Yeah. Well, also, let us not forget that there was another God who was created, I guess you could say, 600 years before Jesus, and that was Mithra, who was born on December 25th. It was a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed in a manger. He was considered the great traveler, teacher, and master. He had 12 companions or disciples. He performed miracles. He ascended into heaven, and he was viewed as the good shepherd, the way, the truth, and the light, and the Redeemer, the Savior, and the Messiah.
Yeah, actually, I remember hearing David Fitzgerald referred to Mithraism as Christianity's sister religion.
Yeah, and he also had Sunday as the Lord's Day.
Right.
Yeah.
So
1 minute to go?
Yeah. So it just, and as you can see, it conforms. Christianity echoes so many of the same Jewish and pagan religious ideas in the centuries leading up that it's easy to see how it could have just been entirely made up.
It can't help but be suspect.
Yeah, and I want to say, as a closing comment, it's certainly possible that there was a historical Jesus, but it's even the staunchest defenders of historicity among secular scholars are not sure.
Yeah,
they won't. They aren't ready to say definitely there is.
10 seconds left.
So our next show is later this month,
28th.
and we'll catch you then.
Yep. Be good, everyone, or at least be careful.